fantastic turnout again. Lovely to see everyone.
Absolutely. No, it's great to see so many people here. And in fact, since the stream of arrivals is slowing somewhat, I think I am going to begin our general introduction, although there will be no doubt some people who will miss it. Well, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see everybody here. As Jane says, wonderful to see such a great turnout from everybody. If just a couple of practical house rules to start, if you can, it would be great if you can keep your cameras on. I realise that's not going to be appropriate or sensible for everybody, but I think it's especially good for our presenters today to feel like they're not just talking into the void. So if you feel comfortable with it, please keep your camera on. Don't worry, we're aware that there might be other things that you need to do in the background. You don't have to sort of keep yourself glued to your camera like you're in a police mugshot or something, but it's nice to feel a sense of connection given how separate we are. So keep your camera on if you can, but please keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking, so unless you're asking a question or presenting yourself. Just one thing to let you know is that we're recording this session, and recordings plus other materials will be on the project website when we finish, so please make sure that you're content for anything you contribute to be recorded in that way. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. This workshop is the second in a series which is exploring the phenomenon of urban depth at different scales. The previous workshop, some of you were here with us for that, was looking at urban depth, thinking about the scale of architecture and particular buildings. This week we're looking at neighbourhood depth. So we're looking at the phenomenon of depth on the neighbourhood scale, and we're thinking about it with a particular focus on how it relates to individual autonomy and how it can promote lives that have this particular important human value in them. What we're going to do is as follows. We're going to have 5 presenters today thinking about this topic from various different academic fields. They're going to give us some really snappy presentations of 10 minutes each, and then we're going to have some time for questions and discussion afterwards, which I'll be chairing. I'll tell you a little bit about how that discussion is going to run a little bit later on, but I just wanted to let you know who's presenting today. We have Jane Clossick, Alice Cabaret, Lindsay McConnell, Vikas Mehta, and Agustina Martire presenting for us. Thanks very much to all of the presenters for agreeing to come along and be part of this exciting experiment that we're running. I want, for those of you who don't know us, to introduce the project team. So the principal investigator on the project is Jane Klossick, our first presenter today, as it happens. Jane, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I do. I was just trying to get on the Miro board, in fact. Hello, everyone. My name is Jane Clossick, and my interest in urban depth has stemmed from my PhD study, which was a study of Tottenham High Road. And now I'm working with Ben and Hannah on investigating the philosophical implications of the organisation of urban space. So it's really delightful to see everybody here, and it's been such an exciting process getting in all these different perspectives on this topic that seems so pertinent to so many different fields.
Great. Thank you, Jane. We'll hear more from Jane shortly. I'm Ben Colburn, so I'm Jane's main collaborator on the project. I'm a political philosopher by training at the University of Glasgow. Jane and I have been talking about these ideas informally for several years, thinking about how one might use the tools of philosophical and ethical analysis to evaluate architecture, and particularly think about why the structures that she describes work effectively in the way that they do. So I'm really glad to be here. I feel like I'm learning a lot about lots of other academic fields while I'm sitting through these as well. And then the third member of our team is Hannah Parr, whom some of you will have been corresponding with. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself, or shall I do that?
I can do a short one, yeah. I'm Hannah. I graduated from my Part 2 in architecture last year from London Met, and I joined Jane and Ben on this project. I think it was last August, and I've been working to primarily organise these workshops. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you very much. So what these workshops are aiming to do is the following. We want to try and understand the significance of urban depth from the perspective of different disciplines. That's why we have, as well as philosophers and architects in the core team, we have contributors who are psychologists, environmental psychologists, sociologists, urban theorists, and people from various different perspectives adding to the conversation here. We're also trying to identify a common language for thinking about these things, and we're interested in building up a collaborative network around this topic. The idea is that we're going to make a bigger funding bid for a larger project at some point in the future, so we're really interested in people who might be interested in that type of involvement. We don't have a very strict and firm idea of what outputs we want up in advance. I think that what we want is for things to emerge organically, and we look forward to everybody who is participating, shaping where we go next with this set of ideas, both our presenters and also the other people who are participating in this workshop. Good, so you know who we are and what we're hoping for. I just want to run through a few practicalities before we get on to the presentations. The first thing is we'd love to know who all of you are. So Hannah has already pasted in the chat to this Zoom meeting a link to our Miro board. Miro is an online collaborative tool, and that's one of the places we're capturing what's happening in this discussion. You'll see if you follow that link that there's a space to note your name on the left-hand side of the board for this meeting. So please create a sticky note and put your name on there so that we have a record of who is here. More generally, that Miro is where we're going to what we're going to use to record our thoughts, questions, ideas, and things that we responses to each of the presentations that we see today. So please contribute to this shared resource. If you have ideas or questions, please shove them up on that Miro board so that they're recorded and so that other people can see them and maybe answer your questions. It's a shared resource. We'd love your contributions, and please don't worry about messing it up or doing anything inappropriate there. We want this to be a work in progress, and we expect it to be a little bit messy in light of the fact that the topic is a slightly messy one that we're just starting to explore as well. If you have any technical problems with the Miro board, then you can send a private message to Hannah, who will try to help you out with any technicalities that you need help with. Or if you're having trouble with that, you can put things that you'd like to contribute into the chat for this Zoom meeting instead, and then we can put stuff onto the Miro board for you. On the Miro board, you'll also find links to information about future workshops. And there's also a link to a briefing document for this workshop as well, which gives some background on what we're talking about today. Although, Hannah, I wonder if you could put a link to that briefing document directly into the Zoom chat as well. It has some information about what we're doing and why. Also up on that Miro board are the Twitter handles and hashtags for this event and for the London Met Art and Architectural Design team. If you do tweet, then please use those so that we can sort of gather those contributions together. Okay, moving on to our presentations. Each of our speakers has 10 minutes to talk. I'm going to give them a warning at 8 minutes so that we try to keep to time. We're going to go through all of the presentations, and then we're going to shift to discussion after that. If you have questions for speakers, then you can put them in one of two places. You can type them out in the Zoom chat for this meeting, and then I'll call people in the question session to ask their questions. I'll also keep my eye on the Miro board, and I'll try to harvest questions from there. But please put your name on any notes that you put there if you'd like me to call you by name rather than just reading out the questions myself. I'll remind you of that before we actually start the question session, however. Okay, thank you. Well, I think that that's everything that we needed to cover practically, but fortuitously, my main collaborator on the project, Jane Clossick, is our first speaker today, so she'll be able to remind us of anything that I've forgotten to say there. Jane, as she said, is Senior Lecturer in Urban Design at London Metropolitan University, and she's going to begin our run of presentations. So, take it away.
Thanks, Ben. I'll share my screen. It's on full screen, isn't it? So I've cheated a little bit, I suppose, because the vast majority of this presentation is actually about the inside of a building. But I contend that the conclusions that you can draw from the structure of the inside of a building are transferable to larger scales, to the block scale or to the neighbourhood scale. So this presentation is about depth structure. My name's Jane, as Ben said, and I'm co-running these workshops. And today I'm going to give you an overview of how I've come to understand urban depth and how it's structured, as I said, primarily at the building scale, but also at the block scale. Oh, there we go. So urban depth is a structure present in buildings, blocks and cities, whereby spaces are differentiated into zones characterized by different norms of decorum, privacy and access. Implicit awareness of these zones inside people and the boundaries between them is what coordinates where people go and what they do in architectural space, both individually and collectively. And I'm going to look at the depth structure of the urban depth of an example shop on Tottenham High Road today. And what I'm trying to do is to create a useful set of concepts so we can understand the underlying structure of architectural space. And the key terms that I'm going to talk through today are zones, thresholds indicated by boundary conditions, and decorum indicators. And so to explore these key components of the depth structure, I'm going to talk through a case study which I studied on Tottenham High Road. This is Crazy Cut, a beauty salon near Bruce Grove. It's just opposite the station. And the salon, it's a single bay wide, so it's about 4 to 5 metres, and it's about 8 metres deep. And although it doesn't show on this photo, it's actually bright orange with an orange sofa and black timber and chrome fittings, as was very, very trendy in about 2002. So here's a plan of Crazy Cut, and you can see the different zones within the structure. Here's the whole plan. And the different zones are shown in grey, outlined with dotted lines. And the objects that mark the thresholds to these zones are shown in red, and the thresholds are outlined with a dotted red line. In the centre of the salon, here, so that's this area, that's the hairdressing area, and there's brow shaping, and there's hair washing here, and there's mirrors mounted on the walls with chairs in front of them. Then at the front here, on this bit of the plan, this is the reception zone, and this is where the receptionist sits by a neatly arranged freestanding shelf, which is here, with products for sale, that indicates the threshold between the waiting area at the front and the reception area and the core of the salon in the middle. And at the back here, through a door, is a private area with a kitchen and toilet, and then upstairs, up here, is the tanning room and the salon area where you can get waxing and other intimate private things where you need to take off quite a lot of your clothes. So here at the front is the zone with the sofa where you wait. And the kind of activities that you're expected to do there are arriving and making an appointment. You could speak to the receptionist, who's the gatekeeper, really, of the zones deeper in the depth structure. You can sit on the sofa and wait to be seen. And the staff might chit-chat to you, but in general, people speak quietly, they smile, they look presentable, they keep their coat on. And this is primarily a place for clients, but staff also sit here occasionally. Then the salon zone, which is behind this shelf that I was describing, and the threshold is around here. Then the decorum changes quite significantly, because you can see here this woman, she's a bit messy, you know, she's got her hair all up in foils and she's wearing this plastic clothing protector. And in this zone of the salon, you get a lot more of informal behaviour, much more personal conversational topics, personal experiences and histories. And also more bodily contact, because the people doing the hairdressing and the brow shaping and so forth need to touch the clients. And the people here will be the staff and clients, but clients can only enter if they're invited in by staff once they've made their arrangement with the gatekeeper, who is the receptionist. Then deeper in the back of the salon, we've got the hair washing area. And this is a bit of a key threshold, because behind here, it's absolutely staff only. I mean, obviously, sometimes clients go up these stairs when they're having treatments done upstairs. But in this little section here, which you can see here, this is very much staff only. And also, this is where some of the mess starts getting put away out of sight. So it's like a back of house type of zone. And only staff would be in that position. And it's quite an intimate relationship that they might end up having here, because the clients will be having their hair washed. And actually, if you've had your hair washed in a salon, you know it's quite a pleasurable, intimate experience. So where zones meet are the thresholds. Oh, I've gone a bit too far. So where zones meet are thresholds, like here. And that's where the social boundaries are defined physically by boundary conditions. So I'm contending that there's never a threshold without a boundary condition. And for example, here the boundary condition is these sinks. And at the front of the salon, the boundary condition is the very neatly arranged shelf. The boundary conditions might include, but this is not a full catalogue, as I'm sure you're aware if you think about the places that you occupy on a day-to-day basis. There might be fixed elements like walls and windows and doors, movable objects, furniture, screens, freestanding signs, surface treatments like wall-mounted signage or decorative finishes and lighting. And boundary conditions are like decorum indicators, and they might include human gatekeepers like the receptionist. But the key thing about this physical delineation of the zones is that it serves a communicative function. It allows people to decide whether or not they're permitted to cross the threshold. And the amount of permeability and information that passes through the boundary condition helps you make a decision about whether or not it's appropriate for you to enter that space. And it's in that respect that these elements of depth structure start to reduce or increase people's individual autonomy, the capacity they have to understand where they're going and what the options are. So in Crazy Cut, the decorum indicators are really quite clear. So the type of decorum that's expected in each zone is emphasised by the objects in it. And that's particularly noticeable in the arrangement of these two different sets of objects, one at the front of the house on the left and one at the back of the house in the kitchen. You can see there's a lot more informality, and in the kitchen you'll have a much looser decorum and a much broader range of activities are permissible. For example, it's all right for the staff to chat to each other in Turkish. Decorum indicators are absolutely, and I suspect also boundary conditions, are absolutely culturally specific, and the interpretation of them requires knowledge gathered over a person's lifetime. These are Turkish blue eye ornaments, and that stool belongs to the owner's daughter. And these are very culturally specific items. So although today I've talked through the depth structure of the interior of Crazy Cut, I think the ideas about these key elements that I've described, the zones, the boundary conditions and thresholds, and the decorum indicators, are also applicable to urban blocks, and such as this one on Tottenham High Road, which is called Morrison Yard. So here, for example, this is a threshold between the high street and the entrance to the yard, and that's indicated by a change in ground condition. And then in terms of decorum indicators, for example, in this working yard, there are skips and there are vans and there are guys with big trays of bread, because this is a bakery. And that contrasts quite clearly with the decorum indicators here. This is the playground of an Islamic primary school. So finally, this diagram shows a typical depth structure. So it has the components that I've described, the zones, the thresholds and the boundary objects, and the decorum indicators. And I think sorry, I've just realised I've gone over 10 minutes. I'm going to be another 30 seconds. A depth structure is this system of social territories, and its key quality is that it contains and reproduces knowledge that enables spatial cooperation. And the physical expression of depth structures through architecture and objects, it creates social life at the same time as being created by it. Social behaviour and spatial organisation co-emerge. Depth structure therefore mediates between the physical world of architecture and the knowledge of the individual. And this knowledge is embodied or tacit, but it's externalized and communicated into the built environment in order to be shared so that we can cooperate even amongst strangers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane. And apologies, I was so absorbed that I forgot to give you your 2-minute warning out loud, but I'll do that for subsequent speakers.
Yeah, not at all. I was timing myself. So it was all good.
Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Alice Cabaret, who is the founder and director of the Street Society, amongst other things. So Alice, I see that you're sharing your screen with us, which is great. Please take it away, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning as we're getting towards the end of your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jane, for this presentation before. So, hello everybody. Thanks for the introduction. I am Alice Cabaret, and I'm an urbanist. And today I'm going to talk about the way the notion of urban depth resonates with the different experiences I have, both as the founder of the Street Society, which is an urban strategy agency, and as the co-founder with 3 other researchers and experts in cognitive neuroscience of City, which is an agency looking at the intersection between neuroscience and urbanism. And I think the common points between those two structures is the very strong interest we have in better understanding, but also improving the relationship between people and their urban environment. So for example, with the Street Society, we mainly work on the creative transformation and activation of underused urban spaces, mostly heritage and industrial sites. And with City, we use cognitive sciences as a way to better understand the interactions between emotions and sensorial perception of space and the built environment. So most of the projects we work on, whether it's at the Street Society or at City, are at a neighborhood scale. And I was very interested in the workshop theme being about the neighborhood depth, because I do think that the neighborhood scale might be one of the best scales to apprehend the notion of urban depth. Why? Because a neighborhood is rarely defined, only by its administrative boundaries or its physical boundaries. Where does a neighborhood start? Where does it end? For us, a neighborhood is a very multi-layered entity with fluid boundaries, and it's made, like a lot of different elements, from personal and collective memories, from the sense of belonging to a community. It's made of formal and informal landmarks. So defining a neighborhood requires such a rich, complex, and a multi-layered approach, which I think really resonates with the notion of depth that we're discussing today. And I was quite inspired by the interdisciplinary aspect of your research project about urban depth, as it reminded me of a methodology we developed in 2018 called Carta Infinita. It's a workshop methodology that we developed with an architecture firm called Atelier Berger-Millat, also based in Paris. And it was created, this methodology, so that we can understand the different and deep layers of a neighborhood. And the first neighborhood we worked on was the Lido neighborhood in Venice. So the first step was to gather an interdisciplinary team of 15 people. We had architects, urbanists, but also, you know, musicians, artists, researchers, and each of us with, you know, our own perspective and skills collected over a few days a wide range of materials of the neighborhood, things that we call the clues of the neighborhood. So it could be interviews, it can be words, you know, from the people in the neighborhood, or sounds or objects. And then what we did is putting all of these elements together during a workshop at the French Pavilion during the Architecture Biennale. And we presented to the public what we called a performed map of the neighborhood. Because with all these different elements, it couldn't just be, you know, a physical map. And what was very interesting was, you know, the mental and the physical boundaries that were appearing on this performed map, and how they were linked to also deeper emotional understanding of space. So I think this experience, which we are now replicating every year in different locations, allowed us to link in a very, let's say, experimental and creative way the spatial, the emotional, and the temporal layers of a neighborhood. And interdisciplinary was key, and I think that's something that I'm really attached to. You know, I think it's critical that we go beyond the architecture and the urban fields to understand what neighborhood depth means. So just sharing a little experience about that, which I think was quite linked to the topic. And then I thought it could be very interesting for our discussion later to show you a few examples of tools we use at the Street Society to just go beyond the traditional analysis of space, which is often, you know, a very demographic stats and built environment analysis, to get a deeper understanding of space. So for example, we developed the street stories methodology, where we ask people on the street to take us on a walk in their neighborhood and explain it through their own words. And we record these walks with a microphone. And you know, it's a very simple process, but the amount of information about the neighborhood you get through this process is really amazing. And as urban depth, I understood from the brief, is also about autonomy. It's an excellent way to understand how your age, your race, your gender can also have an impact on the way people navigate space and the way you're going to navigate space. And Jane, I think it links back with what you just explained about the zones, about the threshold, and about the boundaries within a neighborhood. The other tool we often use for our project, no, actually, we don't use this one so much. This one is very experimental. We created this part of a, you know, we were part of an artistic residency, and we did a test. We tried to understand a neighborhood through the music that the people were listening to. So we stopped the people on the streets in the 10th arrondissement of Paris, and we asked them, you know, what are you listening to? And then we created a neighborhood playlist on Spotify. And what was so great with this experience is two findings. It's one, how music can be an enhancer of your own personal and physical experience of a place, but also how could music be a way to also escape your environment and to link back to another place? So do we go that far with what we call boundaries of neighborhood? That could be interesting to think, you know, oh, because a lot of people say, when I listen to this song, I think about my hometown, I think about, you know, my latest holiday place. So layering these two geographies, you know, the physical place and the mental place, gave us very interesting results with the street soundscape. With City, on the more neurosciences side, we love developing tools that help us quantify emotions and perceptions within a space. So that's an example of what we call the sensorial diagnostic, and how we can maybe define neighborhood depth through senses. So that's one of the tools that we use to, you know, like increase well-being in spaces and reduce, you know, the negative elements within a built environment. We can go about that a bit later in the questions, maybe. And that's
you have 2 minutes left.
Oh my God, that's too much. Okay, okay. I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. That's no problem. That's another example of how you can map the emotions of a pedestrian going through the train station that we've done for one of our clients. How do you measure stress levels, and how it gives you an indication about a certain depth of a neighborhood. And we actually on time, because that's my last example about neighborhood depth. That's really an installation that we did in Le Marais, in the heart of Paris, that for me really links back once again the physical, emotional boundaries of space and temporal boundaries of space, because what we've done here is created a 360 mural representing 50 places that were important in the construction of the identity of members of the LGBTQ plus communities. So we've done interviews and we drew each of the 50 buildings on this 360 degrees artworks. And we developed an app as well as an Instagram page where you can listen to the personal stories linked to the spaces. And I think what was very interesting about that was that, you know, there's so many things to say about how the space that people were really avoiding before because it was such in a bad condition became an attraction, and how, and actually research shows that the better emotional and sensorial experience in navigating this place increased the attachment of people to this place. And this level of attachment to this place generally, and that's what the research shows, then dictates your involvement in the community and your willingness to protect your neighborhood or to take care of your neighborhood. So it's still a research in progress. We're analyzing how it has now a bigger impact on the neighborhood itself and how it links, you know, these personal stories to more collective memories about the space. Thank you.
Wonderful, Alice. Thank you so very much. That was wonderful. So if you could stop sharing your screen with us. Wonderful. Our next speaker is Lindsay McConnell. So Lindsay, if you could start sharing for us. Lindsay is Professor of Psychology at Vancouver Island University, focusing on environmental and architectural psychology. So Lindsay, take us away, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning as we're getting towards the end again.
Okay, sounds good. I think I'll probably need it. Wow, I'm so inspired by what I've just heard, and we're all speaking the same language, even though we're coming from a little bit of a different point of view. This talk is more academic. It doesn't have pretty pictures. Now I'm regretting not putting pictures of the neighborhoods in, but it might be something different. So, and I'm glad I got an opportunity to talk about this because I honestly haven't really talked about it since I defended my doctoral dissertation a long time ago. But I thought I'd talk about exploring spatial navigation and place imageability in the, you know, the Kevin Lynch theory, and then with sense of place all in urban settings. So, there we go. So with more and more people residing in cities worldwide, obviously we're trying to figure out what attributes in an urban fabric offer people healthful places, stimulating experiences, and essentially a sense of place, which is really timely and prudent to do. So this multidisciplinary, multifactorial body of research is trying to do this with sense of place, which is essentially coming forward through a number of different researchers and models as this composition of beliefs and values and structures and commitments and emotions that say that something is special, a place, a physical setting is special to you. And in 2011, I defended my master's thesis trying to figure out whether or not some elements of sense of place were similar to effective organizational commitment, which is found in the body of literature for industrial and organizational psychology. And I found that in neighborhoods, at least, they are not the same, but they are correlated. So they're distinct enough to be measured on their own. And so I published that in the journal Cities, which you probably are all familiar with. And then that sort of led me to doing my doctoral dissertation, thinking about sense of place as the model was put forward by Jorgensen and Stedman in 2001, which splits it up in a tripartite model, which says that there's an emotional component of place attachment, and then an identity component of place identity, and then this sort of behavioral compatibility or goal attainment part for place dependence. And I wanted to see if I could shove in some different factors in that had more to do with the physical environment rather than the residential environment, which is where most of this early research came forward in that context. And no one had really tried to put new things in the model before, so I thought I'd do that. Theoretically, and in terms of my hypothesis, I thought that legibility would probably make sense in terms of predicting sense of place. And I also thought that maybe in our cognitive maps that a sense of egocentrism. So when you use yourself as a cue to orient yourself, saying like, oh, to my right or to my left, rather than saying, oh, you know, my house is behind the storefront or something like that, that's sort of other. I thought that people's cognitive maps would include themselves more if they had more sense of place. So I thought I would do a few studies to test that. And the first study I did was to test whether or not navigational strategy had anything to do with sense of place at all. And I used undergraduate study participants and community members to make a broader sample. And it was just a sense of place questionnaire, very standardized, but I also used a protocol analysis task, which is similar to a walkthrough through your mind. So you basically go through different areas that you're thinking about, depending on whether or not you feel strong sense of place, neutral or weak sense of place, and had people say how they were walking. And I would count the number of egocentric or allocentric spatial navigational strategies that they used and compared that to how strongly they felt sense of place for that area. And then in the second study, I did the same thing sort of with place imageability and sense of place to see if there was a correlation there. And I used the same study participants as study one, but had them do a drawing task or a cognitive mapping task to see how many place imageable features like nodes and paths and edges and landmarks that they would draw on their cognitive maps for the urban settings and the neighborhoods that they were interested in telling me about. And then in study three, we took it out to the community in situ, where I had all of these things come together with a bit of a different twist. Instead of using sense of place as the independent variable, I used place imageability as the independent variable. But the cool thing about this was that no longer were participants remembering places. They were not recalling them. They were sort of in the neighborhood that they were living in and talking about it from there. And so we used current residents of an architecturally socioeconomically diverse place, which was great. And so they had the same sense of place scale, but then they had a sort of an open-ended questionnaire to write down their spatial navigational strategies as they walked around stations of photographs of different areas of the neighborhood that differed in place imageability and the diversity of place imageability. So what I found was for the first two studies, participants were verbalizing more of both spatial navigational strategies across sense of place. And so there were no significant differences within each condition. So there really, when we're feeling sense of place, we use a lot of different navigational cues to describe and verbalize the neighborhood setting instead of using only a few allocentric and a few egocentric. We're very eager to sort of talk about how we navigate, and we can do it very easily. And then sketch maps indicated there for places that had strong sense of place, people were able to draw a lot of place imageable features, more so significantly and statistically more so than when places were weak or neutral in sense of place. And the key things that they drew were paths and landmarks, which may not be completely surprising, but that's what we found. And when sense of place was strong, people were really finding it easy to recall these places, whereas when sense of place was weak or neutral, they had a harder time remembering places on their maps. And we were lucky to have that published in Cities as well in 2017. One note about that in terms of the cognitive mapping task for nodes. So this is these ideas of hubs with lots of commercial amenities or mixed use amenities. People were drawing a lot of nodes in the strong sense of place condition in comparison to the other ones. And that connects with other literature saying that places of pause or areas where you can maybe stop and sort of check where you are and maybe check a map or look at social cues and so on are good places to make decisions about whether or not you do feel attached or you want to sit and stay or use an amenity. And so we'll be following up on that with other literature or other research later. But I think it's a good cue to understand where sense of place might be developing at the neighborhood scale. And then in study three, these findings are currently under review with the journal. Community residents' sense of place scores were higher for the neighborhood area with more place imageable features. So we checked ourselves through the back door, which was nice that everything happened the way we thought it would in terms of a hypothesis. But we also showed that egocentric strategies were verbalized similarly in study one with allocentric, but in this study, actually more allocentric strategies were used. And we think maybe that this is because they weren't using their memory and relying on their memory on how they remembered how to walk through different places, but actually they could more easily recall the memorable, identifiable features in their neighborhood. And also because sense of place wasn't the independent variable, which I think could be an interesting way to go about research later, checking that in terms of a replication. And also environmental familiarity made a difference too. So people who are more familiar and had spent more time in the area felt more sense of place and could do this task easily compared to those that weren't as familiar. So that might make sense too. So just concluding thoughts on this, and I know we'll get a lot more discussion about how it relates to urban depth and autonomy in the question and answer period, but I think overall it was a neat way to add to the recent interest in growth and place attachment and place identity and place dependence work in environmental psychology, and also a way to diversify some of the methods that we use, at least in environmental psych. I was so excited to hear Alice's different ways of doing methods on the street like this, because environmental psych can sometimes be late in the game, and we work a lot with city planners that have cooler ways to do research rather than questionnaires, so I love it. And I think hopefully it'll assist social scientists and planners in clarifying when and where sense of place develops, and also how it is maintained over time, which is the next step in this line of inquiry for us. And understanding better which features, whether or not those features are more architectural and natural is another one, and how often the word home came up is another way that we'll move this work forward in the future. So I know I spoke really quickly, but I wanted to make sure other people had time, and I guess we'll get more to it in the question and answer spot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. A speaker who keeps to time in this way is an absolute joy for the chair of a multi-speaker session like this. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Vikas Mehta. Vikas is Associate Professor of Urbanism at the University of Cincinnati, I think. Is that right, Vikas?
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful. Could you start sharing your screen for us, please? Perfect. Okay, so take it away, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning when we're coming to the end.
Thank you. So as we heard a little bit about the relationship of place to urban design is typically interested in creating places that are special and everyday. But I feel that there's largely the emphasis on creating special places and not so much on the idea of everyday places that has much more relevance to what we're discussing here in terms of urban depth and autonomy. There's, of course, a wide literature on place, but essentially the idea can be summarized that space that is overlaid with meanings by humans becomes place. And I think that becomes very key when we are talking about meaning. We have to somehow get out of the purely spatial or the purely sociological, and in fact, think of how these, in fact, combine for people to think about emotional attachment and place attachment. And place experience, as we know, occurs at all kinds of levels. There's a whole plethora of research around that, but as mentioned earlier, a lot of it is related to home, which is not surprising because that's where you find the most close way of understanding place. But the idea that this is actually a sort of a geography that is beyond home and beyond neighborhood and beyond your immediate block, that's key to understanding how sort of general understanding of the world around us is helped by these scales of place experience. And of course, we know that in contemporary societies, there's loss of place for so many different reasons, which gives us even more, should give us more impetus to think about places that are outside of home, and in this case, in the neighborhood, that help with place attachment. So I'm going to pick up on the work from my book on the neighborhood commercial street, which essentially talked about these different types of layerings, physical, social, psychological, that together help with place attachment and make, in this case, what was about simply called lively streets. And in this talk, I'm going to talk more about one component on those commercial streets, third places, which are places in Ray Oldenburg's terminology that are beyond home and work, and where you have the ability for place attachment. And I'm going to emphasize that characteristic of the third place. So this is a map of Cincinnati where I currently live. It's a couple 100-year-old city, but what's important to note is that the city, which is very, very depopulated now compared to its heydays, still has these main streets all across. In fact, in about 32 of its 52 neighborhoods, these places are still intact. And the reason I want to show this slide is that even in American cities that are, of course, largely sort of sprawled out and repopulating at the center, there is the opportunity for thinking about these sort of main streets and high streets and the third places within them. So this is what these streets might look like in the context where I did this study. And again, I used a plethora of methods which go from sort of very strict behavioral mapping to very, very loose visual surveys, photographs, videos, territorial mapping, and so on and so forth, just to be sort of free of one domain within which one is trying to understand place. And here's a summary map of collected walk-by observations for just one street, which shows where people gathered in lingering and stationary activities over 30 mappings that were then put together. So each dot is a person, but this is not at one time. These are when you collectively overlay 30 maps, you find that there are, of course, certain places that are clearly collecting people, a lot of these, and then other places that are not on the same street with pretty much the same context in the neighborhood. And again, just to statistically try and put it in a chart, there are places where people are also staying longer. The darker color is where they're staying longer. And in terms of the businesses on these streets, there's a clear range of where more people are gathering on these streets. So these three streets here, this slide shows the differentiation between which are the large businesses and which are the small, typical mom and pop owned independent businesses. The yellow ones are the small businesses. And the idea here is to try and understand if there is a simple correlation, which there is, between where people are sort of gathering, where they're hanging out for longer and more people are doing so, is on the street that has many, many smaller businesses. And so one conclusion that a paper was focused on is about small businesses and how they support street life. So not only how they contribute to the overall economy and overall sort of place attachment in the neighborhood, but also directly supporting street life. So I'll focus a little bit on this one place on one of these streets, which is a coffee house. And again, it's a few meters wide, just occupies the space right outside in sort of ordinary but also special ways, and brings a lot back to the street, which is the street that has the same amount of traffic as the next block. This is in Cambridge in Massachusetts. And what begins to tell the story is right from the coffee house and what they intend their place to be. So they talk about how they really want this to be a place of community. And they're proud that many friendships, many marriages have developed here, and there are many theses that have been written here. And one starts to understand that it is not just a place with chairs and tables, but it is in fact a place that creates a real sense of place, even physically. It has this room-like quality that it generates as you notice the kind of activities throughout the day. And when you gather interviews and feedback from people, you start to understand that there is a real way that they think of this very, very personally, related to how they treat the customers, how much people know each other, the different types of people that are there, and the kind of music that is played and all of that. So it together comes to a sense where people who may have very different reasons to come there sort of think of that as a place really important to them in terms of their neighborhood. And again, this is where it's not just people are coming to drink coffee. There's a lot of significant experiences of life that are visible. And so in a very simple way, this is a third place for people that then leads to place attachment, and it has a real sort of urban depth to it for people in that neighborhood. There is a real reason for people to feel proud of it, and people to feel that this is something that makes their neighborhood worthy of them. But then the next thing that I looked at was trying to tease out the qualities of third place. And Ray Oldenburg, the sociologist who coined the term, essentially talked about it in terms of its social attributes. And what I was interested in is beyond that, understanding both the social as well as the physical attributes that are collectively making this a third place. And so it's bringing the social aspects to the design students that I teach, but also trying to bring to the literature that physical aspects are not disconnected and they're actually equally important. So we look at these four things, the fact that these are unique. Thank you. These are places that are, they engage, they are places that are friendly, and they are responsive to people's needs. And within that, there are some very ordinary things that one can actually find, that these places are really permeable. They make an effort where it's not about just the facade being transparent, but it's really their ability to try to communicate with the outdoors in many ways that then make the place interesting, and it makes it curious. It adds a sense of safety to it. There is a very easy sort of casualness between the street and the indoors that permeability allows. And again, it creates this wonderful room-like character with the great in-out connection. These places are very personalized, that they bring to the simple coffee house, this facade, a whole lot of very symbolic personal aesthetic that people can identify with, and they find it distinctive. The things that they do on a daily basis helps with that personalization, creates identity, also adds to the sensory stimulation for the place. And then these things are obviously, again, just measured in terms of third places and even other businesses. Third places do a lot more of that. They're very flexible to how they let people sort of allow some agency in terms of what they can do, even with their furniture, where they can take it, what kinds of things that they're able to manipulate within the environment. And then this is one of the maps that shows territorial mapping, where people begin to claim space and they expand, and territories stick in certain places on the street. And you notice that happens much more on some places than others. And this is where the coffee house is. And again, they will let different people do things with their furniture. They can move this around. They will allow the musicians to set up, and so on and so forth. And then simple things like how they deal with the articulated building facade, and they kind of really engage it as a place for people to shelter during summer months, and so on and so forth. So all of these sort of pieces come together and make this a place that people can, one, in a most common sense, use throughout the year, except for the very cold times, but also then begin to use it again and again, and that leads to that repeated use back to place attachment. But equally important is how the people in the business, the owners and the workers, they treat the place as well as they treat people, not just as paying customers. So I'll try to wrap up here. These are the way that they make the sidewalk much more furnished and comfortable for people, for their sort of bodily comfort, if you will. And again, this relationship between third places and other businesses, that third places do much more of this. Finally, the lessons for urban design is that these are things that are in fact not just associated with these places as shops, but in fact, these are things that are of broader value to urban design as we think about just responsiveness and the democratization of space, as well as thinking about the meaning that they bring to places for people.
Wonderful, Vikas. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Right, so our final speaker this afternoon, before we get to our discussion, is Agustina Martire. Agustina, can you share your screen with us?
Yes, there we go. Can everybody see that?
So take it away, Agustina. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for the invitation to this. It's a bit overwhelming how many things are going through my head about all the previous speakers. Thank you so much, everybody. There's going to be a lot of overlaps, and I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss these. So I'm going to be talking about the Street Space Project, which I've been leading since 2012 in different shapes and forms and different collaborations, but something that Jane and I have been working on for a while together too. So I'm particularly going to be focusing on everyday streets today and what they are. And they are the core of urban life and essential to neighborhood depth. They're under threat by car-led planning, zoning regulation, large-scale development, housing financializations since the mid-20th century. But today I really would like to discuss who are everyday streets for. And this is about people not being generic, but about being specific. And the question today is, how do we as architects respond to these transformations so that of streets so that they remain relevant, inclusive, and accessible? And I'm going to bring in a quote of Donald Appleyard that I highly admire, who said that streets have always been scenes of conflict. The most powerful or well-established groups win, but they do not by any means represent the public interest. And there's so many layers of ways of understanding this quote in terms of gentrification of streets and of all the displacement that I was talking about previously. But who is this public? There's a lot of literature that discusses streets in urban design. This public is called users, and that's the term that many architects and urban designers use, and that would be the case of Alan B. Jacobs, Dover Massengale, Moten and Martens, and Robert Manto. Now, there's another layer that is less paid attention to in architecture and urban design, which is geography and sociology, which some of us obviously will be very familiar with, but is less present in schools of architecture, which is Phil Hubbard, Sharon Zukin, Saskia Sassen, and David Harvey, who talk mainly about spatial justice. And I think that's literature that should be absolutely present in schools that deal with the urban environment. And then a little bit further are people that combine those ideas of urban design with anthropology. And this is the area in which I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable, and people that I have been collaborating with. And these are people like Susie Hall, Laura Vaughan, Sam Griffiths, Matthew Carmona, and Vikas Mehta, who is here today. So what I'll be talking about today is mainly the overlap of, very specifically, urban morphology and graphic anthropology as very precise disciplines to deal with streets under threat. And I'll be discussing Belfast as a case of streets under threat by roads and redevelopment. And specifically the Cathedral Quarter and Sailor Town, which are two neighbourhoods, one in the centre of Belfast and the other one in the very immediate periphery of Belfast. So Belfast went, like many cities around the world, from being a city of streets to being a city of roads from the 1960s onwards, from being a walkable, inclusive, community-led, and permeable and dense city to being a motorized, anonymous, divided, fragmented, and sprawled. And this, let me just specify, this would be the case specifically of the global north, but it's also the case of many cities around the world in the global south. At the same time, and further on, after the 1990s, Belfast, like many other cities, went from a plot-based, diverse, eclectic and local city to a block-based, global, neoliberal and privatized. So all of these things have affected the fabric of those streets very, very deeply. There's the issues then that are reflected here, like eviction, displacement and segregation. So the question here is, how do we map and draw that? And this is where graphic anthropology comes in to give us a hand in ways and in methods of studying this. The Street Space Project works through workshops, exhibitions, symposia, and a collaborative studios. And we work with governments and NGOs, like many other of you, in looking for those ways of making that communication and that connection between people from academia, practice, and policymaking to make sense of these things and hopefully have a good influence on the way streets develop in the future. So this is the way that some of these workshops take place in collaboration between all those different people. And I'll just discuss a little bit some of the analysis we've done in the studios throughout the last, especially the last 4 years. We start from the premise that the street, the people and the place are not generic. There are specific stories of people in everyday streets. So we start by looking at the physical fabric. And then once we have that first approach, we start looking at the social fabric and the specific individual stories of people. So we map things like uses of city center. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but the top line there is the parking surface car parks in the city center of Belfast. One of the lowest ones, the purple one, is the cultural spaces, as you can see, is absolutely tiny. Orange is franchise shops. But then we start looking in more detail at those spaces, and we look at thresholds, and we have at the axonometric, like Jane knows, this is something we discuss, is a very good tool for that. And we look at particular buildings. These, for example, were demolished in 2016, 3 days before being listed. And now they're not there anymore. For 4 years, it's been an empty plot. We look at the flexibility of Victorian buildings and how this particular one was used for the last 90 years. We look at the stories of buildings like Clifton House and how there are things like the green bits that remain or the red bits that were left behind. We look at the different products that are sold, and that starts talking about the way those people, those particular people, use these places. Only about 1/4 of those products are still being sold on North Street, and that's from 2017. We look at the way people move in bus stops, and these are all studies that every student does in depth for a whole semester. We don't just do this as an improvised thing. Each one of these bits takes a really long time. We do interior studies of restaurants and bars. This is a study of people's clothes, but it wasn't just about the clothes, but our students started having conversations with each one of them. And then to understand, there's an assumption that this square never has anybody in it. And Eileen actually made the case that there is. And this is probably one of my favorite ones. This was an arcade, the North Street Arcade, that caught fire in 2004. And this is the drawing of each of the shops based on stories of people that had those shops. And the arcade hasn't been used since 2004. It's a ruin now. But then at least by making this drawing, she's recording this forever. And this is going to be a source for people in the future. The stories of the prison and the hospital on Clifton Road. And then specifically the stories of people. Last year we moved even further in looking at particular people. This student looked at Billy's stories, and they were stories that talked about permeability, about relationships, about scale, without mentioning them, about wonderful things that happened in the 1960s. This block was completely demolished, and there's a motorway on top of it. The stories of especially stories of working class areas in cities like Belfast, but there are many around the world.
2 minutes, Agustina. That's
great. I'm going to be done in 2 minutes. They're stories of the experience of working classes, and it's a really important thing to bring out, because those are the people who tend to be displaced and moved out by roads and and commercial redevelopment. There's the story of Ludwig that spent a whole night trying to look for the Rotterdam bar in Sailortown, and they only found it when it was closed. The stories of children in the streets of Sailortown, the stories of the dockers that queued up in the mornings at 5 in the morning to work in the docks, only to be told that they had to leave because there was no more work for them, and they would end up in the 40-something pubs there were in Sailortown. The story of Gerard's father, who actually went around Belfast selling ice cream and changing the flags according to the neighborhood they were that he was passing through, so he could sell as many ice creams as possible. The stories of gender and ownership of houses in Sailortown. The stories told in the newspapers, because there's an overlap of oral histories with archives that are really important in being able to understand a sense of place, like Vika was saying. So I'm about to wrap up here. The idea of the project is to understand the stories of people in place that tell things that are tangible, like built heritage, housing, density, retail, public space, and movement, but also the stories that tell things that are less tangible, like diversity, identity, agency, vibrancy, authenticity, community, inequality, social justice, and many more, which are part of our discussions. And we have, the second semester is normally dedicated to projects that reflect those stories, in this case, the Halfback Brewery, mixed tenure housing, the RUA Gallery, the Horticultural School, a cycling village, plots for living and working, which is a mixed tenure and mixed use proposal for, these are lands that have nothing in them, that have been completely demolished. So it's about bringing back that density that used to exist in Sailortown and the formal, spatial and social implications of that. Space as the third teacher in terms of a primary school in Sailortown Baths. So I'm going to finish with two quotes. One by John Time: the more resources we commit to road transport, the more we create spatial inequality and social inequality. The only way the privatization, sorry, I can't really read this. I have, of every aspect of the city can be halted is by slowing the transfer of land to large private landlords, is in particular importance to ensure that control over streets remains in public hands. So car-led development and speculative redevelopment erase the particular local and diverse to replace with generic, standard, and global. Depth is in the stories. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Agustina. And I think since we've reached the end of our presentations, I'd just like to thank all 5 of our presenters this afternoon. It's a pretty brutal brief to give people just 10 minutes to try and run through this stuff. And I bet lots of participants are probably feeling like me, which is to say, plunged into a really complicated and exciting set of ideas. But those were all really stimulating and exciting talks. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion. Let me just tell you briefly how I'm going to run this as chair. So if you have questions, one thing you shouldn't do is just stick your hand up, either using the button in Zoom or literally holding it up in the screen, because I won't see you. I almost certainly won't see that happen. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you have 2 ways to do it. You can either put it in the chat window for this Zoom call. That's good because it means that I can see your name attached to it and I can just call people in order. Or you can put it on the Miro board. I can see that people have already been putting stuff onto the Miro board, which is good. If you want me to call you by name specifically, please sort of sign those questions so that I know who asked them. But I might also scoop up some of the questions that haven't yet been given names if people have asked them anonymously, because there are some interesting things there too. I'll try to monitor both places, but please bear it with me. It'll take a little while to get used to all of this. And just to say that if you don't feel comfortable speaking in this forum yourself, you're welcome to just ask me to ask your question on your behalf, if you wish. I think we have about 40 minutes or so for this session. So let me nip onto the Miro and have a look at what's cropping up. I think I'd like to start by pulling together a few different questions that people have asked, which I think is relevant to the presentations that were given by well, possibly all speakers, but especially I think Alice and Lindsay and Agustina. All of you sort of picked out, or all of you used drawing as part of the methodology of your research projects or your activities. And this was a theme that came up in our last workshop too. I was wondering if you could reflect on what's especially good about using drawing as part of a research methodology, and what the challenges are of using drawing as opposed to writing or those sorts of things. So I'll ask yeah, Alice and Lindsay and Agustina to speak briefly to that, but obviously our other speakers can jump in as well after that if they wish.
Can I just answer very briefly? I think, at least in our project, which is, I mean, most of the drawing work is done by the students, and it's also about finding ways of using the tools of architecture for things that architects are not really used to doing, like a building that doesn't exist anymore. How do you rebuild that with stories from people? And when there's no other source, and it's very different from a written description. The drawing basically makes it visible, and I think the same happens with some of Jane's drawings. It evidences things that a photograph and a description would never be able to communicate so quickly. And I think it would be the case for probably all the work of my students, making visible things that wouldn't be otherwise, and it makes them like easier to understand.
Wonderful, thank you, Agustina. Lindsay, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think for my study, it was helpful and less intimidating for people, especially those who said, well, I can't draw, so I can't do this, like you're gonna get bad data. And I thought, you know, don't worry, because I wasn't really archiving the drawings themselves, I was counting things in them, that it didn't have to be, I suppose, especially spatially accurate. It was just their mind's representation of what they could remember, what was meaningful. And then I was the one responsible for categorizing and counting what I saw later. So it was almost, it just took the pressure off for some participants, I think. And it was different than what they had previously done with the protocol analysis, where they were speaking and sort of feeling as though they had to get it right, which order certain features in certain places had to come in, and how they oriented themselves and their bodies. I think it was almost a nicer relief for them during the data collection period to get to express themselves that way. But I think if I had said to them, you know, I'm going to show these drawings or go and look at them for accuracy in the actual place, I think it would have been a different situation. So yeah, it depends on the type of research and the point of the methodology, I think.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Alice, I don't know whether you want to add anything to this.
Yeah, I think we not only use drawings, and I loved what Agustina presented also in using drawing as a way to also you know, keep a memory of lost spaces. I think we use drawings amongst very other different tools, from video, photo, and it's using it part of these other tools that we find it's most interesting, as it shed light on very specific topic.
I'd like to make a little comment, and that's when you asked the question, Ben, it didn't immediately jump to mind that of course you can create drawings as the sort of professional drawing maker, but you can also use drawings as a way to extract from people what they know. And I've never tried to do that, but I'm sure you do encounter a lot of cultural resistance because people are convinced that they can't draw. But what's really important to me about the process of both making a drawing and looking at other people's drawings is that in making a drawing, much like in making a map, or indeed in writing a story, you can't draw everything. You have to be careful about what you choose. And then in choosing, you not only illustrate to yourself what matters, but you also illustrate to other people, you know, illustrate to other people what matters, because sometimes you don't even know what matters until you have to draw it. In fact, usually. And I imagine that's the same is true of people producing these drawings that Lindsay asked them to produce. It's much like if you get somebody to quickly sketch the route to somewhere, like we used to do before Google Maps was a thing. And they would just draw, you know, the cinema in the corner and the right turn and nothing else, because that's all that mattered for that particular answering that question. So it's what's bad about it though? That's the part that I couldn't think of a good answer. Maybe nothing. Yeah.
Can I add to that? So I think the good thing about drawing is it's slow. And what I tell my students is that you should draw often and draw badly, and that's perfectly fine. You're not, and rather than drawing, I use the word sketching, just to differentiate between something really, really quick, you know, and it's like free writing. You know, you talk to writing coaches and they say what's most important is to free write a lot. And so, as we know, you know, drawing is, or sketching is equally a medium of expression. But the nice thing is that it works very slowly. And as you said, absolutely, it takes off all the stuff that is not important and brings and highlights the things that are really important. I mean, this is not the time where we have a limited roll of film and we shoot very carefully. We don't. So it's actually even more important to draw because our ability to capture visually is just unlimited.
Wonderful, thank you. I won't in general ask every speaker to speak to every question, but partly because I was abusing the chair, but also because this methodological question seemed to run through everybody. I'm very grateful for everybody talking about that. I'm going to go now to some further questions that have arisen on the Miro board, and I think I noticed that Maud Ebbers has asked a couple of questions around. I suppose Maud, perhaps you could pose your question to Jane to begin with.
Yes, I can. Yeah, so I was wondering, you showed this on a quite small scale. I'm, by the way, a graduating student of the TU Delft in the Netherlands. Thank you for your presentation, let's say this first. But you showed this theory, this line of thoughts on a quite small scale. Do you think this line of thoughts is also applicable on a larger scale?
I hope so. That's one of the reasons that we want to extend this project really out to a number of different locations and to change the scale. So during my PhD study, I looked at Tottenham High Road, and I think there are a number of key scales that do seem to correspond with the scales that architects and urban designers use. So something about the building, then something about the urban block, then something about the neighbourhood, and then something about the city. And yes, I suspect this is purely intuitive. This is from my own experience of the city and living in a neighbourhood and knowing that there are thresholds between neighbourhoods, and the decorum in one neighbourhood is different to the decorum in another. I mean, my husband and I, we live in East London, and sometimes we go to West London and it's like a different city. People are wearing different clothes. You know, there's different fashion. The accent is different. And that's astonishing to me that it's only within one very large, obviously global metropolis, but nonetheless, I think there are these zonal boundaries, and I think it's like a structure of zones within zones within zones. So almost inside any zone, there will be smaller zonal distinctions within that, and then within that, it's like a nesting. Is how I think of it. So yes, I think so, but we want to do more research to find out.
Yeah, so I'm graduating now, and then they call it neighborhood settings. I think that's one name for it. So you say then in zones, compared between zones, you have also intangible boundaries, and then you call them zones.
Yes, I'm curious about I noticed somebody else commented, or maybe it was you, about whether some of the boundaries are intangible, and I suspect they're probably never intangible, because how would they be a boundary if they were intangible? Because how would people know they had crossed a boundary if there was no physical expression, even though it might be super subtle? I suspect it's probably there.
Yeah, the clothing you mentioned, for example, is tangible partly, but it's not static.
Yes. I mean, there's so many nuances.
Well, this raises this also evokes a question that Michiel van Dorst asked, in fact, of Jane. So before I move on to a question for somebody else, maybe Michiel, you could ask your question about whether boundaries are always, how did you put it? Is a threshold a zone or a boundary, or is it both? Be useful to get into the nitty-gritty there, I think.
Yes, well, thank you, Ben. Yeah, well, that's precisely my question. What we did in research on zoning, if you look to the detailing of zoning, before you know, you invent a zone between two different zones, because there's always a threshold, which can be a place in itself. If one opens a door, do you create a place of a square meter? So I was interested to also via your drawings, Jane, also, at one point in time, we just call it a boundary. Indeed, it's the nitty-gritty, but I think it's interesting from the perspective of how people might perceive it or recognize it. The legibility was already mentioned, and I think this is quite important, how the detailing is working for the legibility.
I completely agree, and it's taken me, I think, because so much of our personal experience of this stuff is embodied and we don't have a language for it. So therefore coming up with a language is a big part of the analytical problem to me. So I was trying to distinguish between the threshold, which could be of any size. It might be a line in the sand, or it could be a whole, like you say, a whole entrance hall, and the boundary objects or boundary conditions that indicate that a threshold is happening. So I was trying to distinguish between the threshold as being, I suppose, yes, a sort of a zone, I guess, as you say, and the boundary objects or conditions as being the indicators that that was happening. So, I mean, it strikes me that it can be all sorts of different things. What do you think? Yeah. Because, of course, this is so aligned with your work.
Well, to make something up at the spot, I think a zone should be a place where there is social interaction possible. When it's less than that, it becomes a boundary in itself. And of course, also a boundary should be very legible and gives a lot of signs, but then most of the time between the physical environment and the social environment or the human itself. Mm. Maybe so, but that's something we should research in the future.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really, these are exactly the sorts of topics that we're looking to sort of thematically list, so that we've got a set of criteria of what to look for. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like now to go to a question in the Zoom chat from Philip Mangan, who's beaming in from Dublin. Philip, would you like to ask your question and maybe direct it to one or two of our presenters? Silence came the stone reply. Are you there, Philip? Let me see if I can see you in the list of participants.
I'm here. Hi, guys. Hello.
Oh, perfect. Hiya.
Yeah, I suppose the question I'm asking is, with the depth of research that everybody has completed, one issue that I've come across, and I'm about to embark on a study, and I don't have a huge amount of experience in the area, in a very traditional and old area of Dublin called the Liberties. When I talk to people in the Liberties and various different representative community groups, they are very critical of researchers researching their place. It's like as if, you know, we are impacting, we're crossing a threshold, and they are saying, look, we've had lots of research, but nothing seems to come from the research in terms of planning. We still have, you know, the planners don't listen to us. We have attended plenty of workshops. So I suppose the question I'm asking in a broad sense is, how do we make the research more impactful for use? That's the question.
That's a brilliant question, which I suspect all of our presenters could say something about. But I think maybe I might ask Alice to step in first, as somebody with a foot in both the kind of academic but also the consultancy world.
Thanks. It's a tough question to answer. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea behind starting City that I presented earlier, that I co-founded with 3 researchers, was to really bring together the academic and research sector with more operational sector. And how do you communicate better about the research that is done? How do you make the results more democratic and more accessible to a wide range from, the users of the space I was discussed before, like the inhabitants, from the people making decisions. So, I mean, we have lots of very positive experiences from bringing the words from the street to the people making decisions. That's why we love using sound, for example, because a lot of the people that make decisions about, building and development and urban development sometimes don't really know the sites, don't really know the stories, as Agustina said before, of the streets, and bringing it to them in a I think it's both ways, bringing also the street stories to the people making decisions is a way to inform positively the decision. And we've had quite a few good examples of that. But now, yes, the Philippe example is a tough one. How do you build trust again with people on the streets that have been disappointed by what's been done before? I don't have an answer for that.
Can I intervene there, Alice? You're totally right. And Philip, that's a tough question, and I know Dublin very well. I used to live there, and I actually worked in North Dublin in a study. And look, the way I think this can be kind of attacked, and something that my project has been shifting in the past few years, is going from the kind of social and urban design generic studies to the very particular. And anthropology is incredibly good at doing some of that. And let me just talk to you about a very small example of this. I think activism is really important in getting the message across. So in my case, I also run a campaign called Save CQ, Save the Cathedral Quarter. Not that, I mean, we live in a world that's dictated, everything's dictated by the market. And in general, especially in places like Ireland and Northern Ireland, the market just is king and will gentrify as much as possible. But from pockets of resistance and working with the communities, working with them and developing long-standing relationships, not going in and doing a survey. Going in and doing a survey doesn't work. It doesn't get the people really involved. You have to involve them in the whole process from the beginning until whenever. For me, it's like a lifetime project, and look, it's a very difficult one, and we don't have the answers. But I think doing things creatively, thinking of small ways. I think Alice's project is really aligned with the way that we think, is doing things that will trigger emotional things in people. In Sailortown, with a group of activists, we've managed to save a church and turn it from an abandoned building in a place that will be a community center soon. And that has been through years and years of people advocating. But you have to have the people involved, those that feel that they belong to that community. Otherwise, if it's just coming from the outside as a thing given to them, it's not going to work.
Okay, thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. I think,
may I just make a small comment very briefly? And I think that, Agustina, you just really touched on it. And that's that it's very site specific often. I think the context, the cultural and the physical context is always very different. And there might be some general rules, but for example, Vikas's research, it would be fascinating to change, to execute the same methodology in, I don't know, in an informal settlement in Freetown. And are there the same types of permeable and so forth for shop fronts that have a similar effect on the way that people move around? So there might be some universals which you could use for design guidance for impact, but also there's, I imagine, much that's extremely culturally specific, and it's that interaction with stakeholders at all stages along your project. You just don't know when you're going to have impact. You don't know when you're going to have that chat with somebody where they go, oh, actually, yes, absolutely, that's a great thing to do.
Yes, funnily enough, since I'm glad you asked that question, Jane, because it was a question that I wanted to ask to Vikas. Actually, myself was how individualized or culturally specific the signifiers were. When I looked at those images of the cafes and the way that they spilled out into the street furniture, I was reminded of some things that David Littlefield and Michiel van Dorst spoke about in our last workshop about how the signifiers of depth might be different culturally, and how what counts as private or public might be carefully articulated. A space that is private for a particular group might be quite public for people within that group or smaller subgroups, or a space that's perceived as welcoming and open for one person might be perceived as extremely hostile and difficult to access for another. Did you find that kind of difference in your work, Vikas?
Absolutely. So the kinds of places I studied, they were culturally very similar, but there is no question that the things that you brought up, that this is it's not a universal sort of set of rules that gets applied to different locations. But I think it's about the method of trying to understand place that's valuable. What was interesting about these places, and I've been doing some of this in Cincinnati, is that there is a sense of openness, which is particularly valuable to very different types of people who are part of that neighborhood in a very, very different way. Some that have arrived, newly there, others that are just looking for work. These places are, in fact, the ones that are very, very hospitable to them. And I think that's something that is universally interesting and valuable to me. But there is no question that what is seen in those few streets may be completely different in a different cultural setting.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And this actually leads on to a couple of anonymous questions that were pointed at Lindsay that I want to raise now. So one person asked, is it difficult to achieve a sense of place within a diverse community, do you think? And I suppose pointing into the future, another question that was asked of you, Lindsay, was how might we draw on what you found to design new places that have place attachment for people, perhaps in these diverse contexts especially?
Wow, two great questions. Yeah, I think it is definitely possible to form sense of place if you are coming from multiple backgrounds and multiple places earlier in your lifespan. I think depending on how you feel and how you relate to places, place attachment is an emotional thing, but it's almost it's not cognitive. Like you can't, if you have place attachment, you almost say, well, I don't know why. Like I can't explain to you why. People form place attachments to places that you would never imagine they should, like prisons, for example, and places where they've, had hardship and yet still they are attached to the place, perhaps more so than the social context. So it's sort of this strange psychological construct that definitely needs more work to understand. It's neat though how strong it is when you get studies that show, people who go through natural disasters and other displacement types of situations, and yet they keep resettling in the same place, even though the risk exists of that place being changed or damaged in some way. And then with the place identity part, I suppose that's sort of an individualized process where you maybe come to a point in your life where you're not you until you hit a certain place, irrespective of the people there, and you go, okay, now I'm me, and that can happen almost anywhere, and it's sort of a spontaneous thing, but still predictable, I think, in a couple ways. And part of that is because of the place dependence piece. And I think that the theories of place attachment that don't include place identity and place dependence as on equal footing as place attachment might be trickier, only because I think place dependence is so independent in sometimes for multicultural situations where you haven't found your place identity yet, and maybe you haven't had an emotional element yet, but you still get your goals attained in a place. If you have certain goals to use a neighborhood in a certain way, maybe you need to push a double stroller and you want to catch a bus and you want to go to the bank real quick and the grocery store and the yoga studio or whatever, your child's school, and you can do those things, you still have a level of sense of place, even if you haven't attached to it or found your identity there. And so I think that particular model of Jorgensen and Stedman might be helpful when it comes to managing understanding this psychology with respect for people with different backgrounds and different ways of knowing and thinking. And the other question is something I'm trying to answer for myself all the time. And it's tricky because my work has sort of moved away from this a little bit recently, but still always usually pulling in the idea and the notion of sense of place. And I think the tenets of environmental psychology and the principles and practices of what we study is exactly what many other people have noted. Studying, spontaneous, the ability or the legibility, the opportunity for spontaneous social interaction, exposure to nature, an element of privacy and refuge, a sense of mystery and complexity and coherence, an interest in spaces and this perception of safety and territoriality and personal space tolerances and so on. All of these things that we study as a field, I think, predict the possibility or the opportunity to create sense of place. But at least with respect to my study, it seems as though, as far as we know, Kevin Lynch's ideas of paths and landmarks being key, still are important in the body of literature. And I think going forward into, more qualitative study now and trying to understand what exactly those places are and how they differ and what the density of them are and what optimal levels there are at different scales is important to do. And hopefully, coming out of this great workshops and the other ones that you guys are running, I think studies like that will likely happen, and this will move forward as a line of inquiry in far more of a mature way than any one of us could do on our own. So I'm glad for the opportunity to work as a group.
That's wonderful. And I need to hold that in my mind, because one of the things we want to do in workshop 4 is to really think about those concrete things that perhaps we could kind of crowdsource some wisdom on going forward.
Yeah.
Jane, did you want to come in here?
No, I was just delighted to hear Lindsay say that final sentence, because that's exactly what we're doing, and it's really enjoyable and satisfying to hear other people enthusing about it.
Sure, splendid. Okay, apologies, folks, that I'm taking a slightly random walk through the questions, but they're coming in a sort of, it's difficult to put them in the strict order here. So I'm going to sort of choose to take as my next one that Matthew Barak has asked of Vikas, I think, about the sort of questions about how different approaches to placemaking might promote sociality. Matthew, I wonder if you'd like to talk us through your question.
Yeah, I'm just going to go back and find it. I have actually just been thinking about, I guess, 3 areas that are of interest to, I've been thinking about while the conversation's been going on, and this kind of builds on what I said earlier. Whoops, it's quite hard to get this thing to zoom in the right place, isn't it? There we go. While I was watching Vikas's presentation, I acknowledge a lot of I thought it was very academic, and that makes me feel comfortable. But a lot of the literature is very familiar to me and makes a lot of sense. I really enjoyed all of the presentations, but I think that a concern of mine was that some of the kind of analytical methods, if you like, or the discourses of analysis that tend, to my mind, to break the unity of a spatial or place-bound experience down into too many bits, atomizing it and trying to make sense of it to the extent that the sense of the whole and of the being there is somehow compromised. And in the literature that Vikas was talking about, I saw that sense of the whole represented specifically in some of the references to the ontological understanding, which, I mean, I come from a tradition represented here by Peter Carl, who's here in the room, but around understanding phenomenology from an architectural point of view, where this sense of being there is the primary understanding that we're looking to recover. And I suppose it's a bit of a critical comment, but there's an extent to which trying to reduce the analysis of how a cafe operates to furniture on the sidewalk without the sense of what the being there on the furniture is like, in terms of the sense that a furniture arrangement on the sidewalk feels like you're taking something inside and putting it outside. And that sense of a reciprocity between inside and outside, and the way the imagination works in regard to that understanding is as much part of the richness and depth of that place than actually understanding where the boundary is drawn on the floor, even if it's a dotted line. So it's a roundabout comment, but just to say, I think that the depth that we're starting to talk about, as well as the richness of spatial understanding, which we're coming to align with this concept of places as opposed to just spaces, is not just possible to be analyzed in terms of these analytical categories that we put in front of ourselves, but needs to be understood in terms of these reciprocities, with the role of the imagination in this and of memories and associations extremely important. Yeah, I guess that's it.
I'll just point to a couple of things. I don't know if this came through, perhaps not that clearly in the presentation. The idea of the notion that there is a room that is created there, room-like quality of that place, is really something that's coming through not only my observations of it over months, but also the comments that come from interviews of people from very, very different backgrounds, people who live in the neighborhood, people who've lived in the neighborhood, people who are just visiting. I think it's collectively putting together and piecing together all of that begins to talk about the sort of the spatial quality of that, not just as pieces of furniture. I mean, the most generic places are using furniture to capture space, just essentially to extend business. But the way that they're able to allow people who are not even purchasing goods from them to occupy that furniture really, really is a way that people then start to understand this is a different place. The same plastic chairs here, the generic plastic chairs, in fact, have a very different meaning than in the other place outside that bar. So I think that there is a much, much more deeper layering of this through some of these very banal elements of furniture and furnishing and decorating and permeability and playing music. But collectively, there is a very, very clear and distinct sense that this is a place, while the other one, which may also have furniture and whatnot, is not. I think the only other thing I'd like to add is that it's equally important for this to come from the people and their experiences, rather than just the researcher assuming this to say, look, there's a large collection of people here always. But that doesn't necessarily amount to being a place, but rather getting that information from the people who regularly or infrequently use that place.
I mean, if I can come back on that for a second, I think I'm really sorry if I presented that as a criticism. I was just trying to think through it. But one of the things that I felt in relation to what you just said and picked up a lot from Agustina's presentation, which is this sense of distinctiveness, where every story is a unique story. And yet, and I work with Jane Clossick, and what Jane would say was, well, you have to take this information and code it. And I think sometimes this coding is incredibly useful, because in amongst all the distinctiveness, you start to see the patterns. And I think in our analytical practices, we need to be able to maintain the sense of the distinctiveness, whereas also the distinctiveness and the being there, while at the same time being able to perform our analytical tasks in a way that can really draw understanding out of it, and perform those analytical and philosophical tasks on the one hand, and on the other hand, perform very pragmatic tasks such as influence policy, if that is what we ultimately want to do.
Yeah, and I think there was a question I asked in one of the presentations earlier was, so certainly there are third places, and it's not a bombshell that a coffee house would be a third place, particularly one that is very visible. But the question I asked was, do you think that if there are 12 coffee houses on these streets where people, go and drink coffee and whatever, and those places are running because they are successful businesses, does that mean that all of those are third places? And they're not.
No.
And the third places are also not just coffee houses and restaurants and bars. Some of them are just convenience stores, which look like, nothing. And so I think there's certain transportability or scalability of this, but I completely agree with Matthew that the richness of it lies in the individual stories. But I also feel that when you overlay a whole lot of this, there are patterns that could be extracted.
Thank you. I think this methodological turn leads us perhaps to a couple of final questions, which some people posed to other presenters that I'd like to just ask, and then I think we'll draw to a conclusion. So I think the first one is a question that Jane McAllister asked of Lindsay in the Zoom chat. This was specifically about your the audience for your drawings. Jane, are you still in the room? Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I think it might have been Agustina as well, both of you. So it's kind of directed at both of you. And I really enjoyed the drawings, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about who you think the final audience for these would be, and how you think they might read them.
Look, can I answer that one from the side of street space?
Yeah.
I think the drawings are not a final. They're not a final thing. They're not a final representation. They're tools also. They're tools to have a conversation about the significance of places. So in terms of things that aren't there anymore, or things that are there and have a value and are at risk of, in the particular case of Belfast, it's just a massive risk of demolition and redevelopment. The idea is to use those drawings to show both the public and the people making decisions that there's value in that. And that's a value that's very particular to those spaces, to those buildings, to those people that inhabit those buildings. But they're by no means a product. They're a thing to be used in a process.
No, quite. So could you say a little bit about how they're generated in that case?
So, for example, in the cases of the arcade that caught fire in 2004, it comes from interviews throughout a whole semester by one student to all the people that inhabited those spaces, that had shops in there, who now have been displaced and have been moved to other places. So that's one example. And that's the way that we've been increasingly spending more time with people. They're not just an interview to one person of what they think of something, but it's to build those stories and turn them into drawings. And Matthew was bringing up Ray Lucas. He's an expert in this graphic anthropology thing, and in really making drawings of very detailed things with a lot of care that show how valuable and significant those things are in that context, in that specific context. I hope that answered your question, Jane.
Yeah,
Lindsay, I think you were a target here, weren't you? Sorry, Jane. I wanted to give Lindsay the chance to answer your question as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it's directed at me, I think because the first two studies were done with undergraduate students and some community members, and I don't really know if, I mean, they were debriefed, but they never really saw the final product. Whereas, and it sort of like Agustina was saying, it was more of a tool to count stuff from them to show whether or not my model worked statistically, which is sort of sad. But in terms of the third study, nobody drew anything, but I did go back and tell them the results of the study. just to explain to them that their sense of place did align with, the diversity and the amount of place imageable features, even though they didn't draw. I think that the audience got something out of it. And even though they were arguably an interested audience, only because they were at a public event because they cared enough to go. But I think it's important too, it sort of comes back to this idea of, public participation and gaining trust and making sure that we plan ahead and have the foresight to make it so that whatever we produce gives back in some way and then affords this sort of cycle of participation and engagement. And I think we all learn each time we do a study what to do better. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. One final question that Jane Klossick posed to Alice Cabaret, which was about the different tools that Street Society used. I wonder if you'd like to just ask that question quickly, Jane.
Yes, I'll try and recall what it was. I'll just pop onto the Miro board and have a look at Alice Cabaret. What colour was it, Ben? And then I can get to it quickly.
It's the pink one on the left-hand side.
Ah, yes, and again, we do keep coming back to methodology, and I really liked what Vikas said about how actually it's the ways that you look which really matter. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about the type of information you got from people when you were doing this walking and talking versus the kind of information that you might get from a more informal interview or getting people to do drawing. And if you could say a bit about why you think you get the information that you do when people are walking.
Yeah, so what different information do we get when we walk and talk with someone instead of having them drawing, right? Okay. Well, I think one of the best things that happens during these walks is the bond you actually create with the person you're interviewing. And it's not like sitting face to face where you ask a few questions or computer to computer, or ask them to perform a task like drawing. It becomes a more personal experience where they take you on a walk in their space. And I think they control also less what they can say about the space, and a lot of very different things and things unplanned, basically things and things that that just appears to their mind while they're walking, come during the walk. And these types of specific elements are very interesting to us, because that really are the layers that are the unpronounced layers of the territory that you won't maybe say during let's say a public meeting, or when you ask to talk about your neighborhood. It will bring something new that you actually didn't even think about before as someone living there. Answering quickly your question, voilà.
Wonderful, thank you. I feel that there are lots of questions which people have posed which we haven't had time to go through, but I'm also aware of wanting to be respectful of the boundaries for people's time. So I think we'd probably better wrap things up there. So I think the first thing to do is just to thank everybody for their participation. I mean, it's been an extremely illuminating discussion, both verbally and in the various written media. Thank you in particular to our wonderful presenters, to Jane and to Alice and to Lindsay and to Vikas and to Agustina. You did a wonderful job. Thank you ever so much. So have a virtual sort of round of applause or something there. The other two things that I wanted to say to wrap up were about what happens next. So you may be so fired up by this discussion this afternoon that you're eager to participate in the rest of the series. You can find out about the next workshop. In fact, Hannah, if you could put a link to the Eventbrite. I see Hannah has already done it. That's the Eventbrite for the next workshop in the series, which is looking at depth on the city scale. It's a fortnight from today, so precisely 2 weeks. And we'll be having a series of speakers and discussion there as well. So do come along to that if you possibly can. Meanwhile, the Miro board remains open. People have asked various questions there, and one of the exciting things about our last workshop was that people carried on contributing via the Miro after the workshop had taken place. I think sometimes some people's minds work in a way that gets them asking questions on the spot. Sometimes people prefer to have a bit of time to digest and then talk about it. Well, the Miro board is a medium whereby we can do this. Maybe presenters could pop in and ask any remaining questions that pop up, and the discussion can carry on there. So please do continue to use that tool if you would find that useful. Everybody is very welcome. We, the project team, will be writing to everybody who's been here at this event this afternoon. We'll write early next week, and that will give you some more concrete information about ways that you can continue to be involved and participate in whatever happens next. So watch this space, there's more coming, but thank you everybody very much for your participation. I think it's given us exactly what we wanted. Jane Klossick, I don't know whether there's anything that I've forgotten to say that you'd like to raise just before we close the meeting.
Only, I suppose that it would be very welcome if anybody wants to send us any reflections. We're going to be sending out a form, but if you'd like to send us reflections as an audience member on the workshop, any feedback, comments, even a couple of lines, then that would be really helpful. But you can also add that to the Miro board.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody very much. Thank you again to Hannah Parr, who makes all of this stuff run in an incredibly competent and smooth way. I think we couldn't do it without you. And I hope to see some of you at the next meeting in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. That was really great. Do feel free, everyone, unmute yourselves and say goodbye before you leave. And we'll get a nice cacophony.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.